Working with
Bryan
Kate
Holtzman.
Ackerman's group at Boston Children's Hospital for about 5 years now. And I plan on continuing to work with her as long as she'll have me and continuing work in this field for my career, which is rather exciting. So without further ado, this paper that I'm going to be talking about was recently published in Sports Medicine. It was a review basically of what do we know right now, what are the recommendations for nutrition for female athletes, which is the subject of a lot of intrigue and innuendo out there. But as we're going to see, there's actually not as much information as we might like. So give me one moment to share my screen. I've got some slides. Hopefully I don't talk too much off of them. Here we go. And I have a laser pointer up, which I believe people can see as well. So first thing, disclosures. This paper was funded by the Gatorade Sports Science Institute as part of their yearly series in sports medicine. And then also any references to any products I make are not those of any endorsement that I personally receive. It just happened to be what I say when I, think about different products or ones that I use personally because they're on sale. So anyways, our outline, I'm going to talk about sort of what I call the problem with research in women's sport and what's facing us. I'll then go through sort of what we discuss in our paper in terms of what's the hierarchy of needs, what are some strategies that female athletes can use. And I'm going to specifically be speaking to endurance athletes because that's where we have the most research when it comes to short sprint athletes, power athletes. The research is really lacking. Also touch on hydration. Then we'll talk about what happens when your nutrition goes wrong insofar as low energy availability. That's, female athlete triad, relative energy deficiency in sport. And then I have to close with the opportunity that is posed to us with what I've called the problem to say that there is some hope with where we're going. So as I said, let's start with the problem. Sorry. All right, so at least in the US, we need to sort of understand a little bit of history to know where we are with sports science research. So in 1972, almost 50 years ago, Title IX was passed, and this allowed for equal sporting opportunities for females on par with males. So since then, women's participation in sport in the US has increased over 900%. Unfortunately, the sports science research hasn't caught up to that. As we can see here, in 2014 to 2020, this is a paper that Kelly herself was a part of. Only 6% of the studies were females only. 63% of them involved males and females. And that's an improvement from the start of the decade where only 3% were females only and 63% were men only. The female athlete triad, which is what I mentioned a little bit ago, has been the only area that's been researched as a female-specific sports science issue. Furthermore, the research that is been done has been largely focused on adolescent and young adult athletes, and we're seeing now that women are participating in physical activity throughout the lifespan. And it's only now that based with this Title IX being 50 years old, that women who have exercised and had the opportunity to exercise for their entire life are reaching menopause, postmenopause, and thus having the opportunity for us to do some research on them. So what are some of the reasons, so to speak, that women aren't studied in sport? First, periods are quote unquote hard to study. Of course, I want to say that women are ignored in research because they are always ignored in medical research because that's just the way it's always been. But the further excuses they use come down to these hormones. So understanding the physiology and controlling for the physiology is more difficult and more expensive in women than men. As I'll show you on the next slide, no two periods are the same, even if they're both what we call normal. Second issue that's related to this is many of the key hormones, notably FSH and LH, they're released in a pulsatile manner, as you can see right here. And so to accurately understand the changes that are occurring with these hormones in relation to across the menstrual cycle, and then with any disruptions that might occur in what I think of with low energy availability, or someone who's getting sick or responding to exercise. It's more difficult to understand than just taking a blood level. So what we have to do in the lab for this is we sample every 20 minutes from these patients over the course of 8 hours overnight. Obviously, as you might think, this is expensive, it's time consuming, it's annoying for the athlete to be cannulated every 20 minutes, not to mention they might get woken up from a nurse or a research assistant coming over and drawing blood from them, which could then disrupt their normal rhythms. You need special facilities, the data collection, you can have some issues, you can have some issues with mishandling of the samples. It's really difficult and requires a lot of experience. And then to make matters worse, as I like to say, as I'll show you in a second, FSH and LH are actually surrogates for the hypothalamic release of gonadotropin releasing hormone. And so they're not even necessarily measuring exactly what we want to measure. And then to accurately study women, we have to stratify them by so many different categories than would have to be done in men. And again, this just increases the need for larger sample sizes, and of course, time, money, et cetera. So just some examples I listed here are the menstrual status, their menopausal status, their gravity, their parity. How are they using contraception? Have they used contraception in the past? And Kirstie Elliott-Sale and a group of others recently just published a great paper on how to methodologic considerations when designing sports science studies for female athletes. So right here, we've got 3 quote unquote normal menstrual cycles, where a normal menstrual cycle is defined as one that occurs every 21 to 35 days. Estrogen is in these solid squares, progesterone is in these open circles. This solid line is the estrogen peak. The dashed line is the LH peak, so the quote LH surge. And then this shaded area is when ovulation is occurring. So quickly, this top section is what you would call a normal 28-day cycle, the idealized version, which would be a 14 days in the follicular phase and 14 days in the luteal phase. Here we have call it a 23, 24-day cycle, where you've got about 10 days in the follicular phase, 14 days in the luteal, and then we have a longer cycle here, 34, 35 days, where we've got, I don't know, 18 to 20 days in the follicular phase, and then you're 13 to 14 in the luteal phase. And again, all of these are normal, and they might be changing for an athlete cycle to cycle. And these diagrams don't account for other non-regular menstrual cycles, such as oligomenorrhea, anovulation, a luteal phase defect. There's many different issues that could come up. So I just like to get down to some anatomy real quick, because I think this is cool. This is the hypothalamus, and just to talk about why we have to measure LH and FSH to sort of illustrate the issue with it. The hypothalamus releases GnRH, and this is a portal system. So GnRH is not systemically released. It just flows through these veins into the anterior pituitary here. The anterior pituitary is stimulated by GnRH to then release FSH and LH. So if we wanted to actually sample GnRH, we'd have to stick a little needle up into the nose, get into the hypophyseal stalk, and measure the blood directly that way, which I don't think anyone wants to do and is not very enjoyable. We do it on rats sometimes. Quickly, this is just, I want to make sure we all are sort of on the same page and understanding our basic endocrinology of the woman's reproductive system. So the hypothalamus is the boss endocrine organ, in my opinion. It releases GnRH to the anterior pituitary. Anterior pituitary releases LH and FSH to stimulate the ovary, which then makes progesterone and estrogen. Now, of course, this system is subject to feedback. So when the ovary is releasing progesterone or moderate to low amounts of estrogen, it exerts negative feedback on the pituitary and the hypothalamus and says, hey, pituitary, stop making LH and FSH, and hey, hypothalamus, stop making GnRH. However, once the estrogen levels are getting high enough, it actually becomes stimulatory to the hypothalamus and the pituitary, and that causes a massive release of LH, as I'll show on the next slide. We don't really know actually how this occurs. We just know that it does, which I think is interesting. So this is one of my favorite examples or diagrams of the menstrual cycle. And one of my gynecology professors said, if you can explain this diagram, you can explain a lot of menstrual physiology. But basically here is the LH surge that I was talking about and the estradiol peak right beforehand. And so at around right here, this where that arrow is, at that much estrogen being released, it flips from a negative feedback to a positive feedback. And then here we can see this is what's going on at the level of the uterus, which we haven't talked about yet. So here the lining is growing. Here in the luteal phase, it's becoming proliferative, it's becoming more nourishing for a planned pregnancy. And then you have menstruation once there has not been implantation of a fertilized ovum. And then here's the last problem, if that wasn't all bad enough. There's so much junk on social media who get pushed by people who took garbage classes for like 5 hours on one weekend. They get a certificate that's been offered by other people who are trying to make a buck. This really makes me angry. First of all, it's not evidence-based, and it sows distrust in the medical community. Also, I think it really preys on women's insecurities surrounding their menstrual cycle, not necessarily being comfortable talking about it and looking for quick fixes. And it really gets me going. And so this is the sort of, as scientists, the wall that we're up against in facing sort of stuff like this, long workouts and excessive cardio may be causing more hormone problems. Well, actually we know that the stress of exercise doesn't affect LH pulsatility, for example. That's been proven by Ann Laux, over 23 years ago. So enough of my soapbox. Let's get on to the meat of the talk, which is talking about these nutritional needs and going through how we can talk to athletes and what are the evidence-based recommendations for nutrition right now. So when we were thinking about how to write this paper and what we wanted to do, we came up with a hierarchy of nutritional needs that was cribbing off of Maslow's pyramid of biologic needs. So you got your basic needs and then on the way up. I am not an artist. I made this in PowerPoint. It's not a great diagram, so I'm going to skip past it. And I prefer this one much better, which was created and posted on Twitter by a nutritionist out in Idaho named Jackson Long. And I sent him a message and I said, hey, this is awesome. Can I use it? And he was like, absolutely, please. So at the bottom of the mountain, we've got energy availability and hydration. Basically, are you eating enough and are you drinking enough? Once you've satisfied that, you can start thinking, am I getting the right mix of macros and micros? Am I too carb heavy? Am I too fat heavy? Am I deficient in iron? Once you've satisfied that, you can then start thinking about like, all right, well, when am I timing my fueling? Am I making sure that if I'm going out for a 3-hour run, am I eating during it? Am I making sure that I'm getting enough food afterward? And then you start thinking about further and further up all the way until you get individualization. And so one of the basic tenets here that I want to pay attention to is if you're going to climb a mountain, you can't just start at the top, right? Like you can't get dropped off by a helicopter up here, you're going to fall off. Or if you try to ascend the mountain too quickly, you're going to get sick, right? If you try to go up Everest real fast, you're going to have a bad time. So I look at nutrition plans the same way I look at training plans and progressions. The first thing is like, you have to have a plan that the athlete can adhere to. You can have the most brilliant evidence-based dietary plan, but if the athlete can't actually do it all, then they're going to do none of it. Same thing with a training plan. Are there going to be too many details for them that's going to overwhelm them? How long have they been thinking about their nutrition and working with nutritionists? So really, we want to start simple and then move to complex. We want to make sure we're not losing the forest through the trees, because if you start looking at individual trees, you're going to end up with plans that say you eat 7.5 almonds at 11:13 a.m. on day 22 of your cycle, and that's just nonsense. I do want to just touch on the menstrual effects in terms of what do we actually know in terms of how the menstrual cycle affects our nutrition. So we know estrogen is an anabolic hormone. It's going to increase your muscle strength and your bone mineral density. At endurance-based levels of exertion, women oxidize lipids at a higher rate compared to men. During the luteal phase, we have less glycogen use. However, all of this is to say, while we know these components, we really don't believe at this point that there's enough data to say that there is a cycle-based approach to take to nutrition. I also just want to note that most of these samples, most of these studies are based on studies of men and with ends that are in the single digits. So we just need to understand where we're coming from when we're talking or when we're interpreting our data. So let's start with protein. Protein gets a lot of attention in the supplement world and, among people who hang out at the gym with me, but there really aren't that many recommendations. So the American College of Sports Medicine says 1.2 to 2 grams per kilogram a day. Other recommendations say if you're working out more than an hour and a half a day, so that would be 10 hours a weekish, you need at least 1.6 grams per kilogram a day. More might be better, but nothing above like 2.5 grams. In the luteal phase, the higher progesterone levels mean that you might need more protein because progesterone increases protein catabolism rates, but that hasn't necessarily been shown. It's more theoretical. And so when designing the diet, when you're thinking about day to day, what do I need to be meeting just in terms of what I'm eating breakfast, lunch, and dinner, that's when we want to focus on protein intake. Say like, all right, we need to get call it, for a 60 kilogram athlete, 120 grams of protein. Get that in during your major meals. And then of course, if you have a vegetarian or a vegan athlete, they might not be meeting the requirement. And that could just be because they don't necessarily know the foods they need to be eating to get the protein requirement because they're not having the meat. And so it's really great to be consulting with a dietitian, especially for vegans. So carbohydrates, I probably should have put this in my disclosures that I love carbs. I'm not going to get into a discussion of keto here or low carb, high fat. That's beyond the pale of this. But basically, we know that if you don't have enough carbohydrates, your exercise performance is going to be reduced. You have less muscle glycogen, which means that you can't contract your muscles. And you've got low blood glucose, which means you've got low circulating glucose going around, and your cognition, the way your brain's working, it functions not as well. And so you're not going to be as good as like certain skills if you're playing ball sports. I want to note that glycogen that's stored in the muscles can't be mobilized into the systemic circulation. So you could have a situation where you have adequate muscle carbs, so you can still run, but you have low blood glucose because it can't actually get into the bloodstream. Which we also want to know in terms of a menstrual effect that we know of, gluconeogenesis rates, so that's turning glycogen back into sugar, they're higher in the follicular phase than in the luteal phase. This could cause a theoretical performance detriment during the luteal phase, but we don't actually know if that's true. And you can kind of get around it by just having a snack that has some carbs in it. And there's been shown to be no performance decrements. So during exercise, how much do you need to eat? It's entirely based on duration. It's not based on weight, which is somewhat interesting. So for durations less than an hour, you don't need to eat any carbs. Just because you don't need them doesn't mean you're not going to benefit from them. So next time any of you are out on a run or on a bike ride, anything like that for like an hour, take a gel at 30 minutes, see if you feel any better. You might. For 1 to 2.5 hours, 30 to 60 grams per hour seems to be the sweet spot for this. And then for longer than 2.5 hours, this is an interesting area of research now in terms of is more better. So greater than 60 is definitely what we think. Greater than 90, there might be some suggestion of that. There's athletes who are doing 120 to 150 grams of carbs per hour. So I think it's going to be a really interesting area of evolution. And then after exercise, we want to focus on the restoration of lost glycogen. So there's this recommendation for 1.2 grams per kilogram per hour for the 4 to 6 hours after exercise. This is going to be also changed by if the athlete has to train again later in the day. So say that they did a morning workout and then they have to do an evening workout. That might sort of change their timeline. And if that's the case, you can add some protein in a 4-to-1 carb to protein ratio. And that all has been shown to not have any, to sort of mitigate any effects of lost performance if you're not being able to get these 1.2 grams of carbs. So I think you might be saying like, what does 60 grams of carbs looks like? What does 100 grams of carbs look like per hour? So I took a picture of this. This is what it would look like for 100 grams an hour for 5 hours. So we can see here, these bottles are filled with a drink mix. We've got some shot blocks here, some bars, some gels, and some waffles. One thing I want to mention, which is sort of beyond the scope of this, is that training the gut is a really real thing. So if you try to go out and take 100 grams per hour without ever having done it before, your stomach is going to be really unhappy. You basically can't absorb it that quickly. Also, you need to spread out the intake over an hour, not do it all at once. So I remember one time I was talking to my mom about this, and she had one of these sticks of blocks, and she was like, yeah, I ate them all at once and I felt terrible. I'm like, well, that's because you weren't supposed to eat them all at once, but that's my fault for not telling her. But in terms of gut training, there's a great review from 2017 that was also done for GSSI by Oscar Ukendrop. And what gut training has been shown to reduce fullness and bloating, increase your gastric emptying rate, so how quickly the stuff moves from your stomach into the intestine, been shown to improve your absorption of carbohydrates and improve your the delivery of the carbohydrates to the peripheral tissue. The other thing I want to mention, sorry. This picture right here is 535 grams of carbs. That's over a pound of carbs, which is non-trivial. I also want to mention that this is expensive, and that when we're advising athletes on how to improve their performance, we need to consider how much these things cost. So this is in US dollars. I think that we probably have a mostly audience from the UK, so I'm sorry, but this is $33.25. Of course, these are foods that are more expensive than any old regular food because they're specialized sport nutrition foods, and you can reduce that cost by making your own facsimiles. However, they might not be as digestible as these specialized foods, and it also takes time to make the snacks themselves. If you are advising athletes on this, I do just want to mention that many times a lot of purveyors are going to have like first-time sign-up bonuses with discounts, and so you can get like 20% off. And they're basically just sugar. They don't go bad, so you can stock up on them and save a bit of money. So now we move to carbo loading, which I don't know if in the UK, if this is really a thing, but in the US, high school teams often have pasta parties where team gets together the night before a race or a competition and eat a bunch of carbs to improve their performance, which the upshot of that is the part that's going to improve their performance the most is being relaxed the day before a race. I want to note when we're interpreting studies about carbo loading, women tend to oxidize more fat and less carbs than men. And so we just need to keep that in mind when looking at these recommendations, which are, again, from largely men. So what's the recommendation? For events less than 90 minutes, what's going to limit your performance is your ability to clear any waste products from exercise versus your carbohydrate availability or energy availability. So the recommendation for those athletes, sprinters, et cetera, is just maintain high levels of carbohydrate throughout your regular diet. So that's going to be 7 to 10 grams per kilogram a day. When you have events that are lasting longer than 90 minutes, however, you can actually improve your performance with some carbo loading. So 36 to 48 hours beforehand, you can start loading. You don't need to do this for a week. 10 to 12 grams per kilogram a day is what the recommendation is. There are some phase-specific considerations here that can increase the glycogen levels, but there's been no changes in performance that have been noted. So, for example, in the follicular phase, if you load at 8.4 to 9 grams per kg per day, you can increase your glycogen 17 to 31%, but there's no change in performance. So is it worth it? I don't know. In the luteal phase, similar thing, if you load at 8.4 grams per kilogram per day for 3 days, or you do 4 days at 78% of your diet of carbohydrates, you can increase your glycogen, but again, we don't know what it does to your performance. So really, again, I just want to highlight that I don't think there's good data here for seeing a difference in performance based off of where you are in your cycle. I also want to say that for athletes who are eating a relatively low calorie diet, that this is like these recommendations here are really hard to meet. So again, for a 60 kilogram athlete who's eating 2,500 kcal per day, which is like, a decent diet. That means that if they're doing 7 grams per day, per kilogram per day, 67% of their diet is going to be carbs. If they're up at the 9-gram range, almost 90% of the diet is carbs. And that means they might end up being deficient in other macronutrients. So it's a hard thing to think about with when we're designing these carbo loading strategies, in terms of, we don't want to necessarily lose out on everything else. This is, I think, why we need more studies in women. So we can go to the last macronutrient, which is fats. And there's really not a whole lot of recommendations on how much fat athletes should be taking. Basically, the one recommendation is 20% of your calories should come from fat. Go ahead, do it. One of the fears that athletes often have is that fat consumption will make them fat. That's not true. And it's been shown that being deficient, or having a diet that is deficient in fat, will increase your injury rate. And if you don't have enough fat, you're going to get deficiencies of fat-soluble vitamins. So that's vitamin A, D, E, and K. And you can also run into frank caloric deficiencies. All right, so those are our macros. Let's dive into the micronutrients. And we're going to start with iron. And I think iron is something that's often talked about among athletes. That's definitely where I first heard it, and coaches, and can be poorly understood in terms of what it all means. So first of all, iron deficiency is not anemia, and anemia is not necessarily iron deficiency. They are two different things. What is anemia? Anemia is defined as a decreased red blood cell mass, or a decreased hemoglobin concentration. So this is done typically with the hemoglobins. So a mild anemia is a hemoglobin of 11 to 11.9. Moderate anemia, a hemoglobin of 8 to 10.9. Severe would be less than 8. And then typically we transfuse someone if their hemoglobin is less than 7. When you're evaluating someone for anemia or iron deficiency, you need a wide panel of blood markers, which I've outlined here. Typically, again, what I always heard of before I got into actually doing this as a scientist was ferritin, ferritin, ferritin. If your ferritin's low, you have iron deficiency. And that's not necessarily true. You have to put it together with other components of the panel. So your serum iron, your TIBC, which is your total iron binding concentration or capacity, and your percent saturation. Ferritin is notably what we call an acute phase reactant, which means that it's super labile and it's prone to change based on other systems and other stresses that are going on. Here, there's a great review about iron deficiency in athletes, and this table is taken from there in terms of what's happening with iron deficiency as you get worse and worse down the line, and also the different markers, I would say, like in terms of defining it. How are they iron deficient? Do they have deficiency? Are they truly deficient but not anemic? And then do they have an anemia? And so I won't just talk us through that table, but it's there for your viewing as well as the citation. And this right here is the algorithm that's used. I'm not going to run through it. I just put it up here to say someone who's anemic, what the workup. And so again, it's so much more than just iron deficiency. You can see iron deficiency, they can either be, normocytic or microcytic, and there's just a whole list of things and tests that have to be done. So it's so much more complicated. So all of that said, iron athletes become iron deficient, and that's just the truth of it. And I think that we can prevent it in a lot of ways, but there are some athletes who are at higher risk. So those who have restrictive diets, or they don't have red meat, if they're vegetarian or if they're vegan, they're at higher risk. Athletes who have repetitive foot strikes, it causes what's called foot strike hemolysis, where literally the force of repeatedly running actually shears the red blood cells, and it gives them a shorter lifespan than what's normal. Heavy endurance training itself, even if it's on a bike or something that's not causing striking, can cause antioxidant depletion, and then that leaves the red blood cells prone to oxidative damage, and again will decrease their lifespan. And then some athletes deal with heavy menstrual bleeding, and they can become iron deficient or anemic from the bleeding. When should you suspect an iron deficiency? The most common complaint is reduced performance. However, of course, athletes have any host of reasons to have reduced performance. And while it again is really tempting to pin it on iron, you got to be thinking more broadly than that. So what are the recommendations in the US for 14 to 18-year-olds, 15 milligrams of iron per day, 19 to 50-year-olds, it's 18 milligrams per day. However, these are not athletes that these recommendations were developed in. The US Armed Forces, which of course is going to be a highly active group of young women, they say 22 milligrams per day. If you find that an athlete is iron deficient, the thing to do is consult with a physician and a sports dietitian. The physician is going to, of course, help figure out why are they iron deficient, and the dietitian is going to help prevent it again in the future. Basically, the first step is increase your dietary intake of iron-containing foods, and if that fails to do it, supplementation is possible. IV iron is the fastest way to do it, but that's really only in the hospital. When we give patients in the outpatient setting, we'll give patients a slow release ferrous sulfate formulation. It's the most effective. Iron can be really tough on the stomach, so this is the most tolerable formulation of it as well. And then you can give vitamin C along with your iron because that will help improve the absorption. Next micros, calcium and vitamin D. They get a lot of attention because they're really important for bone health. Of course, we think a lot about bone health when it comes to the female athlete triad and relative energy deficiency. Oftentimes, athletes who are energy deficient are also deficient in calcium and vitamin D. However, gain a handle on what an athlete's calcium status is and measuring it is really difficult, because if you just take a blood test of an athlete, their calcium level is going to be basically normal, even if they have insufficient calcium intake, because the bone is just a massive store of calcium in the body, and the parathyroid is really good at maintaining calcium homeostasis. So it'll just tell the body, eat up the bone, and keep that calcium at a nice normal level. So the way we assess calcium and whether or not it's adequate or not is by doing a dietary recall, which can be difficult to get an accurate recall on. So for athletes who are at risk, those are going to be our classic leanness sport athletes. We say 1,500 milligrams per day. However, it's important to note that these need to be in divided doses that are maximum 500 milligrams per dose, because if you use too much more than that, the stomach and the gut can't absorb that much calcium, and it just ends up being excreted. And so you're not getting everything that you're absorbing everything you're giving your body, and you might be thinking you're adequately supplementing when you're not. When it comes to vitamin D, generally in our foods, there isn't a whole lot of vitamin D, so you can get some fortified foods that have more vitamin D in it than what's naturally occurring. Our at-risk athletes in this case are those who are going to be living at northern or southern latitudes, so that's above the 35th parallel. Those who are training indoors, of course, because they're not being exposed to the sun, and those who are covering their skin either as part of their uniform or because they don't want to get sunburned. A daily supplementation is about 1,000 to 2,000 IUs per day. However, there are sometimes when you become deficient, you'll see people who are on 50,000 international units a day. That's a lot and should only be done under the guidance of a physician. Anything much more than 1,000 to 2,000, you should be talking to your doctor first. So here we have the different quantifications of what the vitamin D status is. Typically, we say below 30 is deficient, but we should really be aiming for levels that are greater than 50. And as you can see, this gap between adequate and toxic levels is really, really wide. And so it's hard to have too much vitamin D. I think the highest I've seen was like 80 or 90, and that was really impressively high, but the patient was totally safe. Also, vitamin D will help improve calcium absorption in the gut, which is of course great because it means we're going to be getting more calcium. But we want to say don't consume your calcium at the same time as your iron, because your iron will be inhibiting calcium absorption in the gut. So like this could be something, if you're doing supplements, it's easy to split them. But if it's the morning and you're having your milk, your coffee or your cereal with milk, and you take your iron pill with it, you might not be getting your calcium. So lastly, hydration. Again, this gets a lot of attention. In terms of daily hydration needs, you can actually just do it without a plan, just drink to thirst. The recommendation right now is 2.7 liters per day, which with 2.2 of that coming in the form of free water. During exercise, however, a drink to thirst mechanism or plan actually works pretty well. Typically, that comes out to be 0.4 to 0.8 liters per hour, and that the body kind of knows what it needs. When it comes to replacing, sweat, and this becomes the realm of sports drinks, these numbers I don't think actually mean a whole lot. 20 to 30 millimoles per liter of sodium and 2 to 5 millimoles per liter of potassium. It's actually really hard to know what electrolytes and how much of each of them a certain athlete needs, because there's so much inter-individual variability in sweat composition. That said, if you're exercising for a while, it might be a good idea to be taking in something that's a sports drink or with eating. Those are both going to have your electrolytes in them. Also, when we are hydrating, you don't want to, oh no, it's like 9:30 at night, I'm behind on my water, and just chug it, because you're going to get poor absorption, and as well as your stomach's going to not feel great. So hydration should always be done slowly and in a measured fashion. Of course, hydration is poorly studied in women. Estrogen receptors are ubiquitous throughout the body. Of importance, they're present in the hypothalamus, the cardiovascular system, and the kidney. All of these organs are involved in hydration, and so they are thus prone to cyclic changes. The osmostat, which is sort of dictates how much we need to be drinking, it seems to change throughout the menstrual cycle. While there is an increased body core temperature in the luteal phase, there hasn't been any increased risk of heat illness during the luteal phase. This is a picture of the nephron. The nephron's really, really complicated and a really impressive component of the body. And so the kidneys are incredibly resilient, and they do their job quite well, which is why for most athletes, a drink to thirst mechanism is going to work for them. However, we do have some issues when hydration goes wrong. This is sort of split into two main categories, which is heat illness and exercise-associated hyponatremia. So I'm not going to get all into the difference between heat exhaustion, heat stroke, and hyperthermia. However, the risk factors are, of course, being dehydrated and exercising in a hot environment without acclimating. And then exercise-associated hyponatremia, there's a Tamara Hugh Butler article is a great review and a position stand on the current recommendations. Basically, it occurs when your free water intake outpaces your losses. It happens more commonly in women, which is of note to us. And so for long, hot events, that's when you want to start thinking about a specific hydration plan for an athlete versus a drink to thirst plan. So the classic place where exercise-associated hyponatremia became apparent was at the Ironman triathlon in Kona. We've also seen it once in the 80s and 90s when there was a whole push to hydrate, and you'd have marathons that would have hydration tables with just water every half mile, and people would be drinking all the water thinking that that's what they were supposed to do, but they weren't replacing any of their electrolytes, and they would come in with pretty profound hyponatremia. So getting down toward the end of it, talking a little bit about energy availability. So I oftentimes find myself thinking, like, what the hell is energy availability? Which is kind of troubling because I spend a lot of time thinking about what happens with low energy availability. So just so we're all on the same page, your energy availability is your energy intake minus your exercise energy expenditure, which I'll come back to, normalized to your fat-free mass per day. So each of these components is pretty tough to measure. Your energy intake is hard to track outside the lab. Retrospectively, it's often done with a 3 or 5 day dietary recall, which, as we can all imagine, like, I can't remember what I had for breakfast today, much less like, did I have a snack yesterday at 2 p.m.? I don't know, I might have. And then if you want to do it prospectively, you have to ask people to log everything they eat, how much, what do they drink, how much cream do they put in their coffee? It just becomes really onerous on the athlete. And exercise energy expenditure might be even harder to measure in free living for two reasons, I think. First, unless you're on a bike with a power meter or an erg, you're kind of guessing. On a bike, if you got the power meter, you can do some calculations to figure out exactly how much you're using. But beyond that, there are some standardized metrics, but when we're using individualization, it becomes difficult. Also, what qualifies as exercise, right? If I get up to go downstairs to make my coffee, did I exercise? No, but I spent calories. Like, does that mean that I should count it? I don't know. Typically, how we think about it is if someone's doing something intentionally for duration greater than 10 to 15 minutes at a moderate intensity, then we'll call it a component of the EEE. And then the last part of this is the fat-free mass. Again, this is probably beyond the scope of this discussion, but they vary. The numbers that you get vary quite a bit based off of the method you use, whether that be calipers, a DEXA, different BIA metrics. So I'll refer you to this Casper article that was just published back in the winter in Nutrients, which is thankfully open access. So a lot of us might have seen these different energy availability ranges. An EA of 45 kcal per kg per day is something that we say is like normal energy availability. You're going to maintain your body size. It's when you can really function your best as an athlete. Anything above that, you're going to be thinking about gaining weight, muscle mass, muscle hypertrophy, and also during carbo loading prior to a long competition. Below 45, but above 30 is when you're going to start seeing weight loss. And then below 30 is traditionally thought of as being low energy availability, and you're starting to see some of the negative sequelae of REDS. So I just, again, like, what does this actually look like? Because we talk about these numbers all the time, but I don't think anyone ever actually puts it into real words. So I just made up a theoretical cyclist. So we have a 60 kilogram cyclist. She's 20% body fat. So that's 48 kilograms of fat-free mass. Let's say she does 100 kilometers of cycling at 150 watts, which will come out to be about 2,000 kilocalories of exercise energy expenditure. For reference, this comes out to be a hard endurance ride for this woman who would be about a high category 3, low category 2 rider, which for those who don't know is a very well-trained rider, however, not a professional. So how much does she need to eat? We do the math out, not going to talk you through it, but that if she's doing this every day, which she probably isn't, but if she were, that's an energy intake of 4,100 kilocalories, which is like a lot of food. And so I think we want to be aware when we're thinking about this and talking about these numbers, how do they relate to this number? And so using this same math, you can see that even if she's down at this 30 kilocalorie per day range, 3,400 calories is quite a bit of food. So I think that when we're advising our athletes, we want to just remind them that they do need to eat quite a bit. So this is the female athlete triad, and I just want to be wary that I am going a little bit long. The triad sequelae are all included in the REDS model, which I'll bring up next. Notably, each component, while they seem interconnected, they can all arise independently and in isolation. Thus, you can still have triad, even if you only have disruption of one system. Low energy availability, as you can see with these arrows, they can mediate menstrual disruption and poor bone health via disrupting the hypothalamic pituitary ovarian axis. Basically, the short mechanism by which this occurs is the low energy availability disrupts GnRH pulsatility. That causes abnormal LH and FSH release, and that causes less estrogen to be made. Estrogen, of course, is osteoprotective. It inhibits osteoclast activity. Our bones live in a dynamic equilibrium where osteoclasts and osteoblasts fight to build and break down bone. Ultimately, this decreased estrogen will cause more osteoclast activity, which chews bone, than osteoblast activity. So we have more bone resorption than formation if we don't have enough estrogen. So this is the REDS model, which first came out in mid-2000s, but really got a lot of attention in 2014 with the IOC consensus statement. So basically what it does is it puts energy deficiency at the center of this model and says, hey, it touches on a bunch of different systems. It's more than just menstrual function and bone health. So for example, we see euthyroid 6 syndrome that can coming in the endocrine area. As we talked about, you have hematologic disruptions where if you're energy deficient, you're probably iron deficient. You have psychologic disturbances. Patients who are quite energy deficient can have some pretty stunning cardiovascular changes with dangerous arrhythmias and bradycardias. It goes on. And then on the other side here, this calls out many of the performance changes that can occur as a result of the energy deficiencies. So that's some doom and gloom about how we don't have a whole lot of research in women and we really need it. So I promised I would end on a positive note. So while we don't know a whole lot, we have a whole lot to learn, which is really exciting for researchers in this field. So my group at Boston Children's was recently part of a new, very large multi-institutional effort to improve sports science. This is called the WUSI Human Performance Alliance, totaling $220 million. Of course, we're not getting all of that. Unfortunately, that would be great, but it's being split among these institutions. Our group is going to be focused specifically on female athletes and female athlete health. We have 3 themes that are going to be going on with our research that's upcoming. Basically, first, what's going on with the menstrual cycle? Can we prevent injury and how can we improve performance? Second, what's going on with relative energy deficiency in sport? And third, how can we improve female athlete resilience? Every other year, we have a female athlete conference. It was virtual this past year. The next one will, of course, be in 2023, and we're looking forward to having a really big conference to go with now that we have a lot more funding and attention. This is a worldwide collaboration that we're undertaking. We have collaborators all across the globe, which makes coordinating calls between the UK, Australia, and the West Coast quite difficult, but it's really exciting. And we're super excited to see where we're going to go with this. So I think that we have a tremendous opportunity for women to sort of catch up with men in terms of the knowledge that we have and the guidance we can provide them. So with that, I'll take a break. Here is my email. Here's my Twitter. Here's what I do when I'm not thinking about female athletes. Although I do spend a lot of time thinking about different studies and such when I'm out in these beautiful places. So I will stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much for that, Bryan. It was brilliant. Really enjoyed it. We have a few questions coming in on Facebook that I'm jotting down as they were coming in, and we've got a couple on the chat there now as well. But we're just going to start with this one from Facebook. So thoughts on vegan/plant-based diets for females? I know you're not a nutritionist, but I throw that one at you.
Sure. I mean, what we know and has been shown is that any diet that is restrictive, even if it's medically indicated, so even if you're lactose intolerant, right, which should be normal physiology, basically, that's been shown to increase the risk for an energy deficiency. And the more restrictive the diet becomes, the higher risk you are for an energy deficiency. And then you start getting into the realm of specific macro and micronutrient deficiencies. So I think it's possible for athletes to be vegan. I think that it's really important for them to be working with a sports dietitian to help them make sure that they're being healthy and meeting their basic physiologic needs in addition to supporting their exercise. Meats have a lot of fat and a lot of protein, and so those fats especially have a lot of carb or calories in them. So if you want to be making sure you're meeting those high calorie goals that I showed, you're going to want to make sure you're doing it right.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. There was another one that said, how can we, when you mentioned social media, it was how can we get around the current social media trends for tailoring nutrition or performance and training to the menstrual cycle? As in, how can we get correct messaging rather than brainwashing was what was mentioned.
Oh, I wish I had a good answer to that. I don't know. I think that I'm not on Instagram. I had to get someone else to send those to me. Yeah. But I think the key is we just need to continue to be vocal in terms of promoting the knowledge that we have and that we know, and calling, and I don't want to be a keyboard warrior and calling out every single one of those posts that's wrong and trying to fight it with facts. It's tough, and it's the environment that we live in right now. But if anyone asks me my opinion on those sorts of things, I'm happy to listen and to talk to them about it. I think a lot of it just comes from a knowledge deficit. So as far as we can improve that knowledge deficit that's I think the best we can do at this point.
Yeah, definitely. It's a difficult one, that one in question. Then there was another one on thoughts on iron supplementation, specifically for female athletes, especially if they're heavy menstrual bleeding. I'm guessing this comes from a food first or a supplement first perspective. I thought that's what they meant by that.
Sure. I mean, I think that food first is always the place to be. I think that if you're known to be iron deficient because of the heavy menstrual bleeding, there's two things. First, talk to your doctor and figure out, make sure it's an iron deficiency, and if they would recommend a specific supplementation routine, I think that's fine. It just, again, depends on the severity of the supplementation, or sorry, the severity of the deficiency. I am against being like, oh, you feel tired, just take some iron. I don't think that that's medically indicated.
Yeah, definitely. And then a question on, is low energy availability more common in females? And is it also more common in young females specifically? And if so, why do you think that is?
So is it more common in females? I think the answer there is yes. I think that something that I'm tossing around in my head and have some early data to suggest is that the level of energy deficiency needed to see the negative sequelae is, you need to be more deficient. Men need to be more deficient than women for a longer period of time before we start seeing those issues. And so it could be that we're just not capturing them all quite yet. Is it more common in young women? It depends, or younger girls, women. Kind of depends on how you're defining younger and how you're defining more common. I think it's also really hard to measure like who's energy deficient and not. And particularly in puberty, your energy needs they grow massively because your body's trying to grow really, really hard. And so when we're treating these athletes who have been energy deficient, they sometimes need to go on these massively high diets. Like, they're not exercising at all, but they'll be on 5,000 calorie diets because they're become hypermetabolic and their bodies just need so much nourishment to support that growth and development. So I think it's a really difficult time. Compound that with the social component of getting more agency over your diet. Maybe you start liking to cook, you're eating more things, you're not necessarily eating what's just put in front of you, you're going out with friends. So I think all of those play into causing an energy deficiency at that age. I'm not sure. I don't recall any data off the top of my head that says like it's more common in 13 to 17-year-olds than 23 to 27-year-olds.
Yeah. No, that was really interesting. And then linked to that was a similar question in terms of, do you think low energy availability is more common in recreational athletes? If so, how can we increase the education around in that population?
Yeah, so I love that question because is it more common? Again, I don't know. I think it's definitely underappreciated in recreational athletes and under-identified, like, for certain. You get people who maybe they played a sport in college or played a sport in high school, and then they just get into running to stay healthy. And then they decide they start really like running. And then, like maybe it's time to start training for a marathon or a half marathon or something. And they become energy deficient. And I think another thing I want to highlight is it's really easy to get calling, oh, she has an eating disorder, he has an eating disorder. And it's like, actually a major driver of energy deficiency is lack of knowledge. It's just, oh, I had no idea how much energy I was burning and how much I wasn't eating. It's just like, I'm just eating what I always ate. And so I think that in terms of how do we fix that, we just have to spread the knowledge that we have. I think that these sorts of talks are great. We can do it on social media. I mean, I'm not trying to pump my own stuff here, but this paper has a companion paper that's written, it's available for free, that's written more for like a non-scientist level, but more for the public. It's like, hey, here's some basic recommendations on what you can do to improve your health. And so I think getting that stuff out there can help quite a bit.
Yeah, no, definitely 100%. If we take a couple of questions from the chat as well, I know we're nearly out of time, but first question was, what do you think would be the main element of nutrition to emphasize for young female athletes? So between the ages of 13 to 18 years old.
Sure. I think, at that bottom of that pyramid, like we have, is like just making sure you're eating enough. Even before that, I want to say just like encouraging a healthy relationship with food, and healthy, positive body image, I think is going to go a long way. I like to talk a lot about food in terms of nourishment because I think it's a really positive word versus like calories or eating or good or bad foods. Like there should not be good and bad foods. Basically, what I want to emphasize to athletes those age is nourish yourself. Do what feels good. This is the same approach I take with training for athletes I used to be a high school track and field coach. It's like I want to focus on your growth, and then we can start, if you are doing really well, we can start fine tuning it a little bit, but I would start there.
Yeah, no, definitely. And then there's another one saying, I know you're not a dietitian, but how would you increase requirements of energy, carbohydrates when there is hypothalamic amenorrhea?
How would I increase it?
Yeah, how would you go around about increasing them? Yeah.
Well, so if someone's having functional hypothalamic amenorrhea, which just to give that a definition basically means that it's what I described, where the hypothalamus, the pulsatility of the GnRH release gets screwed up, likely due to an energy deficiency. It's not necessarily about carbohydrates, it's just frank calories. And so depending on the severity of the deficiency, and again, if they're amenorrheic, there's a whole algorithm that needs to be gone through with a medical workup to make sure that there's not another organic cause of the amenorrhea. Let's say we've done all that. It really comes down to working with a sports dietitian. It's going to be identifying, how much is the athlete burning and how much is the athlete consuming. If it comes out that they're running 70 miles a week as a 13-year-old, like start there, tip those scales in the right direction, because they're probably not going to be able to eat enough food to support that quite yet. And then it's a slowly building up of the diet. In when it comes to eating disorder treatment, we start with actually like a 1,200 calorie diet a day and then increase it by 200 to 400 calories a day or a week, depending on if they're inpatient or outpatient. So it's a really long graduated approach, and it depends on where the athlete's starting, but it comes down to, you got two sides of the scales. You got to eat a bit more and you got to exercise a bit less.
Yeah, definitely. And then finally, just sorry, going to squeeze this one, but does supplementation need to change throughout the menstrual cycle, especially for iron?
I don't think so. I do not know any data to suggest that.
Yeah, no, go ahead, keep it nice and simple. Yeah, the 100%.
So I think that to get a little more in depth, and I think the question is probably asking if I have a patient or an athlete who is heavy menstrual bleeding, do I need to supplement them with iron during those bleeding days? I think the answer is they probably are needing supplementation throughout the cycle. And again, I would advise consulting with their primary care physician or their gynecologist. Would also just like to throw a endorsement for gynecologists in terms of treating heavy menstrual bleeding. If it's bothering the athlete, there are many different strategies to improve the menstrual bleeding as well as dysmenorrhea, or also known as painful menstruation. I like to say that, and I understand that this is coming from a male, that every woman deserves a period that doesn't suck. So, talk to your doctor and they might be able to help out.
Yeah, no, great messaging. And then just really quickly, is it possible to get that link for the sister article that you talked about as well to include just with the recording? You can just whiz it to me and then I'll make sure it goes out with the recording actually, if that's okay at the end. But yeah, thank you so much for allowing us to ask lots of questions at the end as well. And a big thank you to all for joining us, whether it's here on live or on Facebook as well. This session has been recorded and will be available to view in the next couple of days. And I'll also send that link out with it as well. You can also find all of our previous meetings on our YouTube channel as well. Finally, there'll be no next meetings for the next 2 months, so December, January. Totally my fault, as I'm going to turn my focus to writing the final few bits of my PhD up, but we will be back in the new year. So I look forward to seeing you all again then. But thank you again so much, Bryan, and thank you to everyone for joining.
Thanks for having me, and thank you everyone for attending.
I'm just going to let everyone drop off and then I'll get that link from you. We can send out. There's a few hanging around there that I just got rid of. I hope they're all right. No, that was really good. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, if you just send the link in an email, and then what I'll do is I'll send it out with the recording.
I just put it in the chat,
Oh,
or
in
I
the chat.
can email it to
No,
you too.
that's perfect. I'll take it out of that. I'll remember. Wow. There we go. No, that's perfect. Thank you so much for that. I really enjoyed it. And there was lots of questions there. Normally we don't get as many questions as that. So yeah, no, that was really good.
All right, great. And you can include one of my emails in the contact stuff too. I'm always
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, bombarded with more. But yeah, no, that's brilliant. Thank you so much. And yeah, enjoy the rest of your day or evening or whatever you've got planned.
Okay, thank you so much. Thanks for inviting me.
No problem. Speak to you later. Bye.
All right, bye.